Good morning, everyone. Today is a good day for a great gray geek lady book review. This is actually a vlog I've been wanting to post for a while, but just haven't gotten around to it. Now, I usually read fiction, but I do try to sprinkle in some nonfiction. Sometimes it's for research to get an idea of a piece of world that I want to build for a story. Other times it's just because, hey, that seems cool. And one of the areas of nonfiction that I'm most interested in is entertainment history and film analysis. And to that end, I spent a good bit of time back in January reading through this book, A Woman's View: How Hollywood Spoke to Women, 1930 through 1960, by Jeanine Basinger. And this is a fascinating look at a genre that we don't really see anymore, the woman's picture. Now, the woman's picture is not the same thing as today's, quote, chick flick or rom-com. The woman's picture of the 30s through the 40s and then on into to the 50s had a little bit more substance to them. The stakes were a little bit higher, and frankly, there are a lot of movies in this particular genre that I love, so naturally I wanted to read an assessment of them. How Hollywood spoke to women. So Basinger starts her book by explaining that during her childhood, the adults in her life really did not talk to her much about what it meant to become a woman. And since she really had nobody to give her any kind of guidance into what adulting as a woman might be, she had to look to the movies to give her ideas for who she was supposed to be, who she might become, and what was supposed to be important in her life. So she started seeing all these women's pictures at the multiplex and noted the things that they seemed to be telling her. This is what you should want. This is who you should be. And yet also, being a perceptive film viewer, she started to notice some contradictions. Here, read a quote. The movies of those years contained some highly contradictory information about the woman's life. For instance, although women seemed to feel that husbands were the most important thing in the world, men apparently were not to be trusted because they were always dying unexpectedly, getting fired, or running off with chorus girls. These movie women seemed to feel that it was desperately important to be married, yet marriage was an economic disaster in which women had to start baking pies professionally or taking in washing. Women were supposed to be sexually desirable, knowing how to tempt and satisfy men, but they were also supposed to be innocent and pure. How was that going to work? So, what exactly is the woman's film? What defines the woman's film according to this book? Well, there are three main pillars of the woman's film that she defines, and she spends the rest of the book looking into how these pillars work in the women's film, how they're meant to indoctrinate, to present certain messages, but also how contradictions are woven into the plots of so many of these films. First, a woman's film must place a woman at the center of the story universe. I am a woman and I am important. Also, to reaffirm in the end the concept that a woman's true job is that of just being a woman, a job she can't very well escape no matter what else she does, with the repression disguised as love, or love is my true job. Then, to provide a temporary visual liberation of some sort, however small, an escape into a purely romantic love, into sexual awareness, into luxury, or into the rejection of the female role that might only come in some form of questioning. What other choices do I have? So, over the course of this book, she looks into quite a few individual films describing how they work, how the characters are created, how they're fashioned, how they are put through their story, how they are both the center of the universe, how no matter what else they may want out of life, at the end of the day, love is a woman's true vocation. And yet, in the same breath, offer a contradiction by suggesting what else is out there. Now, as I said before, I love a lot of these women's pictures. Some of my favorites, That Hamilton Woman, which tells the story of Emma Hamilton, Lord Horatio Nelson's Grand Amour, and then Random Harvest, which stars Greer Garson and Ronald Colman, two of the classiest actors you're ever likely to see in a romantic film. And then one film she goes into quite a lot of detail about in this book, Bette Davis's Now Voyager. I love that the women in these films are the center of the films. I love that they command the audience's attention, and I love that they have substance to them. These are not shallow, one-dimensional female characters. They are smart, they are resilient, and they are active. They do not stand around. If they're the center of the world, they can't afford to stand around passively while men do things. In the woman's picture, despite the supposed propaganda, women get to do things. It's about them, it's about their lives. Yet something just isn't quite right. The women's film of the 1930s through the 1950s is a little bit like Best Animated Feature in the Oscars these days. There's the woman's film, and then there's everything else. A movie starring a woman, this is what kind of film she can be the lead in. But men get everything else. And this is how things have been changing a little bit. I'm actually kind of sorry to see the romantic drama or the woman-centered drama not being at the forefront of popular culture anymore, although we do see them sometimes. I would argue that a movie like Anatomy of a Fall or Poor Things or Past Lives, I would argue that these films that were nominated for Best Picture and were presented with Oscars earlier this year, I would argue that those films do have certain things in common with the woman's film, although at least in those films you don't have the assertion that love is a woman's true job or that being a woman is essentially the most important part of her identity or her vocation. But still, there are little echoes, even in the present day, of the woman's film, as Basinger describes it in this incredibly readable book. Yes, this is a book review, not just talking about the subject matter, but the book itself. Again, if you are interested in this genre of film, you really need to read this book because she really does go in them, out of them. And my favorite part is that despite the fact that she has a lot of critique, she looks at these stories through a critical lens. It's also clear that she too has an affection for movies like this. That even though she looks at them with her eyes open, there's a fondness for the movies that she talks about in this particular book. So now we don't really have the woman's film ghettoized in the way that it was back in the early days. And I'm glad that while I have these kinds of stories, I also have things like nowadays we can look at a character like Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs. I want to highlight her for a minute because I remember mentioning her in a blog I wrote a year back in thinking about Best Picture winners, as this was the first time you saw a Best Picture winner with a female protagonist where the woman's life centered on her job and her need to do that job, her need to do that job well. So I'm glad we have the heroines of the women's film, but now we have the Clarice Starlings in our lives. We get to look back on a lot of these often wonderful films, but also look forward. We don't have to say, here's the film about women and here is everything else. Want to close with an interesting quote. This is a quote from Richard Corliss, a reviewer for Time magazine. And he's describing Now Voyager. He says, far too long, respectable film critics approached the challenge of compiling a 10 best list with Kierkegaardian fear and Caligari-esque trembling. I'm not going to go into what those actually mean. The interior monologue went like this. What will my colleagues think? What will my intellectual readers think? How can I defend a film as art if I include any Hollywood produce among the received masterpieces? After all, Potemkin, which I admire but don't really like, is the very stuff of cinema. But Now Voyager, which I love but am afraid to admire, is only a movie. As a result, the typical 10 best list wound up looking like screening selections for an undergraduate course in seminal cinema 101. And the Now Voyagers of the film world were relegated to a mind closet containing all of the critic's secret sins. Why is that quote important? Because it shows you that for a long time, and even on into today, popular culture tends to regard movies about women, movies like these women's pictures like Now Voyager, as being less important, less worthy of attention, less worthy of study. No matter how good they might be, no matter how much critics might enjoy them, they have to keep their enjoyment a secret because these movies, we're not supposed to value them on the same level as movies about the doings of men. So I'm glad Corliss points that out, and I'm glad we have this book to give the women's pictures the attention they deserve.